This particular piece of legislation simply removes a large area of America from the Wilderness Study Act. And yet this committee over the last couple of years has managed to look at these areas in a case-by-case way, based upon studies that have been done locally. I'm looking at the Omnibus Lands Act, Wilderness, that passed this committee in the 111th Congress. Some areas were wilderness study areas that were designated as not suitable for wilderness, that upon further study actually became wilderness areas, and some wilderness areas became open. That kind of case-by-case analysis is really what we ought to be doing rather than a blanket approach, which is what this particular bill is. I'd like each of the witnesses to describe one such case that they may be familiar with. For example, Mr. McKeon's bill last year that became law in the 111th Congress in the Mono County area. Are you familiar with that, Mr. Abbey?
Yes.
Could you just briefly describe the process and what actually happened?
Well, again, it's a process that worked. Again, at the local level, the publics and the various stakeholders came together. They talked about the pros and cons of designating certain acreage as wilderness and releasing other acreage from wilderness consideration. Working through the local congressman and through legislation, the Congress, passed an act that did designate some areas and release others. We see that often. As frustrating as it is for some of us in managing some of these lands, that we would like to see a more timely action on the part of Congress to resolve the wilderness issue once and for all. I think overall the Congress has acted very responsibly in dealing with the wilderness issue and taking the time necessary to try to reach a consensus at the local level to make sure that those areas that are worthy of wilderness designations are the ones that are actually designated. And then those public lands that are managed under currently wilderness study area status that are not worthy of designation could be released for other purposes. We see that example over and over again. Again, we have testified in opposition or raised concerns about the bills that propose sweeping designations. A couple of examples, if I may, Congressman, is the Colorado Wilderness Act that we testified in opposition to in March of 2010. The American Red Rocks Wilderness Act that we testified in opposition to in October of 2009. And the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act that we testified in opposition to in May of 2009. Again, those bills were very encompassing. They dealt with designating everything that was before the Congress at that point in time as wilderness and had very little acreage being considered for release. We need a balanced approach when we discuss which areas should be designated and which ones should be released.
So it really is a case-by-case or region or area-by-area analysis. This particular bill, with regard to the wilderness study area, simply wipes out and does not take into account the individual attributes of an area. Mr. Sherman, if you could speak to the roadless issues and the way in which that has worked over the last couple of years, rather than a blanket approach, a case-by-case approach.
Yes. As I think I said earlier, we have about 58 million acres of roadless in this country. These lands, while they are protected from new roads generally, although there are exceptions from time to time that are allowed under the rule, each of these areas is governed by a forest plan. And when these forest plans are updated, we look at areas that might be suitable for wilderness designation. And where they are, we propose this to the Congress. But if it isn't accepted by the Congress, clearly we continue to manage these lands for multiple uses in the future. But we do this on a case-by-case basis, and we think a broad sweep where all lands, all roadless lands, would be potentially subject to roaded areas would be unwise.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. I'll close with this. It seems to me that this bill is a rather easy way for those of us members of Congress to avoid our district responsibilities, to avoid the responsibility that we have to work with our constituents in our district to resolve these questions of whether an area should be wilderness, whether it should be wilderness, and that it is our responsibility to bring before this Congress specific pieces of legislation, and that a blanket approach, such as we're seeing here, is an abdication of our personal responsibility to our constituents and to our district. And I think for that reason, we ought to put this bill aside and get on with doing our homework.
3310.
Thank you.